In this CBT Nugget, we're back for some more planning for virtualization with Exchange 2013, and this is number 2 out of 3 that we're going to be doing. And actually, this is kind of where we get down into the nuts and the bolts. And so we're going a little bit further away from planning into, well, looking at what Exchange wants from you if you're going to virtualize it. In other words, settings for your hypervisor, stuff like that, and getting into some of the things that will affect the performance. So get ready for some nuts and bolts. Here's what we're going to do. So now we're going to start to look at requirements. Yeah, the kind of the nuts and the bolts of everything. And this is where we're going to dive into what you want to deal with for a hypervisor and some of the settings that you want to use for your hypervisor and the virtual machines themselves. There's a lot of do's, and of course, there's going to be some don'ts in here as well. Now, like I was saying previously in a previous video, look, this is some Hyper-V information, but most of the information that I'm giving you is the same regardless of what hypervisor that you use. Always make sure that you check with your hypervisor recommendations specifically for Exchange. And if you're not the virtualization expert for your particular hypervisor, talk to one who is, who can look that information up. However, the information I'm giving you really does apply across almost all of them. So I think you're going to find that this is pretty generic, but also specific for Exchange. The other thing that we want to dive into, and you know, I want to do this a couple of cool ways, is we want to look at the things that affect the performance for Exchange. Now, there's this thing called the user's mail profile, and you know, how do I ballpark scaling up my virtual machines for Exchange? In other words, when I make a VM, how much memory and processing and all of that kind of stuff do I need to do for it? Well, there's an easy ballpark way to do that, and we're going to do that right now. And then there's another way, and that'll be video number 3 that I'll show you that I think you're really going to like. So, well, let's go ahead and get started here with some of the requirements for Exchange. Now for the requirements for Exchange on your virtualization platform. And I know, you know, up to this point, it's kind of like you might have already known a lot of this information, but don't underestimate that. There's some good tidbits in there, but it just probably hasn't been very exciting so far. Well, this is where it gets a little bit more exciting, at least for me. This is when we're getting down to the brass tacks, really. And I thought I promised I wouldn't use terms like that, but this is where we're really getting down to the nitty-gritty, the nitty-gritty, the brass tacks, all that kind of good stuff. So next 2 parts, requirements for Exchange, and then how to look at some of the performance aspects for Exchange. Well, this is pretty much everything. Now, the first thing is, let's start off with some of the basics here. And these aren't basics. I shouldn't say basics. Let's get just a few things straight right away. Okay, when it comes to, and we've talked about this, your hypervisor. Whatever hypervisor you're going to use, there's just, you need to make sure that the hypervisor that you're using is on the it's the server virtualization. Okay, so kind of close. Server virtualization validation program. Now, here's the good news. There is no real bad news. It used to be, especially when Exchange 2007 first came out, the question was, can I virtualize it? And the answer was, no, don't do that. Then Exchange 2010 was, yeah, sure, go ahead and do that. You know, within reason. Just make sure that your hypervisors, you know, been basically validated by Microsoft. In other words, the Exchange team, they've dog-fooded it. They've had a chance to test it to make sure that it works. Now, that doesn't mean that you will not have to, you know, look up maybe some white papers for your particular environment, but it works. So you want to just make sure that it's been cleared on this program. And guys, the major ones that I'm sure the one that you have back at the office is on this list. Because you're going to be working with VMware or Citrix, or you're going to be using Hyper-V and SCVMM. So those are going to be on the list. Life is going to be good. Here's another kind of rule about your hypervisor. And wherever you're going to install, and I'm going to use the word Hyper-V right now. Wherever I install Hyper-V, here's where it is not going to be. And this will make perfectly good sense to you. Don't install this on a host that is already doing something else. I mean, period. Just don't do it. Just don't even bother. I know that there'll be some guys that say, well, your host could be doing this. Maybe it's a web server, or maybe it's also doing it. No, just don't do it. You want to dedicate the host. I've seen guys put Hyper-V on and then set up VMs like Exchange on a domain controller. Are you kidding me? Or even worse, even worse. And I'm drawing a circle because it's even worse. Yeah, a SQL box. No, 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 no. Because remember, you're sharing this hardware with those guest VMs. And what you don't want to do, it's going to be hard enough to calculate out how your guest VMs are dealing with that hardware. You don't want to have to sit there and go, okay, but wait a minute. I've got this underlying technology that's also using some disk resources, and it's also using some processing, and it's also using some networking. It's going to be, I don't know why I went to Valley Girl mode on that, but you don't want to do that. So you want it totally dedicated to being your host, your hypervisor. Now, a couple of other things. There's a lot of information on this. When you set up Hyper-V or whatever your hypervisor is going to be, and you create a guest VM, when you make that guest VM, and I'm drawing a picture, and I'm just going to call it guest. When you make a guest VM, you get to choose how many virtual processors that thing has. Now, this is kind of, we're kind of lying to the system here. Let me give you an example. If I have one core, which I don't even think you could find that anymore. I could lie and tell the guest, pretend you have 2 processors with that one core, and we can kind of share the time with some other VMs and stuff like that. You got to be careful about this processor virtualization stuff, especially when it comes to Exchange, because Exchange is kind of like the real deal. It wants real gear, and it's optimized to use real gear, and that's how it figures out how to get its best performance. Now, from Microsoft, what you'll see is this ratio. You'll see 2 to 1, which basically says for every physical core processor, you can go ahead and tell the VM that it has 2 virtual ones. So this is virtual versus physical, or I should say, core. Physical core. We'll just put that in there. And this works fine. Now some applications you can go further. You could say 4 to 1, and they'll work just fine. They'll play nice with other VMs. They'll share that processing time, and it works okay. Exchange. No, don't do that. Don't go over to the 2 to 1 ratio. I need to be honest with you. And so, oh, by the way, the 2 to 1 ratio would be something like this. If you had 16 cores, that means, you could say you had 32 virtual processors. I know you can do the math. I just thought I'd throw it in there. When it comes to Exchange, I have a tendency to be myself, probably a little bit conservative, maybe a little bit, and I'm just going to tell you that maybe I might be a little bit too conservative. Let me tell you why I'm sometimes a little too conservative, and it'll make sense how I adjust this number. I am very, very, very concerned with overall performance. Now, we haven't exactly talked about performance yet. That's actually coming up next, but I have a tendency to be very concerned with performance and availability. So when it's me looking at designing an Exchange environment, and it doesn't matter whether it's physical or virtual to me, how it's going to end up. What matters to me is, do I have the availability that is required? And now that also means the disaster recovery availability, which we're going to mention here in a second. Can I recover my stuff as well? So I'm all about availability, and from the previous videos, we're talking DAGs, we're talking CAS, load balancing the CAS roles, all that kind of stuff. But the other thing to this is, and to me it's just as mission critical, is the overall performance. Have you worked in an environment where the Exchange environment, the messaging environment, doesn't perform well? Have you worked in one where it performs really bad? Now, usually this happened a lot to us because a lot of us did not calculate out IOPS properly. In other words, how much disk performance I needed to give Exchange everything that it needed to perform well. It wasn't that Exchange itself was a poorly written product. It was that we didn't give it the right amount of hardware. Well, a poorly running Exchange environment for when it comes to performance, I mean, this affects everybody in your company all day long. I mean, this is one of their primary mission critical applications. And so I have this thing to be a little bit maybe over the top with performance. So having said that, when it comes to the ratios, all right, I have a tendency to go 1-to-1. I have a tendency to be more on the conservative side and go 1-to-1. And you'll definitely see some things, some Microsoft articles and some Exchange MVP articles where they'll say, I have a tendency to go 1-to-1 too. You won't be wasting it, not when it comes to Exchange. So kind of consider that ratio when you're setting it up for your Exchange requirements. Now that's pretty much wrapping around the hypervisor. Now, what I want to do here is I want to clear this screen and give you a few things that you should never do with this hypervisor and Exchange. So, hang on here. Let's do this. Let's clear the screen. Let's clear it. Oh, there we go. Here we go. And so let me give you a couple of things not to do, or that you shouldn't do when you're working with virtualization and Exchange. First of all, I mentioned this earlier, but let's talk about and this time I'm going to see if I can spell it right. Snapshots, and if you have a replication technology in place, different virtualization platforms do snapshotting and that kind of thing differently, but I'm talking about your virtualization platform now. Don't use snapshots with Exchange. Some of you may remember that this has also been kind of a traditional thing with domain controllers. Think about this. If you roll back a snapshot on a database, think of the terrible corruption-oriented things that could be going wrong. Now, if you're one of those folks that's really up on the latest and greatest technologies, one of the cool things in Server 2012 and Hyper-V is that we can now actually snapshot a domain controller, but that's more of a kind of a trick than anything. Basically, the domain controller doesn't, if you roll it back, it's not that its database gets rolled back, it just asks everybody else for the most recent update. When it comes to Exchange, no, we don't even want to go down this road. So snapshots are not the resilient feature that you want to use. You want to use what we've already talked about, high availability with DAGs. So this is a no. Don't do this. And that gets a lot of people into trouble. Something to think about also is everybody's virtualization topology supports this. If you have some sort of memory over subscription capabilities or features built in it, and basically in Hyper-V, you'll see it as what is it? Dynamic allocation of memory. So dynamic allocation. This is another one of those no. Now, are you going to corrupt things? No, you're not going to corrupt things. But here's the deal. So dynamic memory allocation means that a VM could have its memory reduced while another VM has their memory increased. The problem is the Exchange uses its memory to actually cache its indexes and to work with its databases. It actually optimizes its database cache in memory to reduce I/O to a page file. And so think about this. If you suddenly take the physical memory that it's getting and you reduce it, it's going to have to start to cache out to a page file. Well, that just increases the overall I/O. In other words, it works technically, but it's hurting your performance overall. So, when it comes down to setting up the VM, the actual frame that your Exchange environment is going to run into, it's pretty simple. Don't snapshot it. Don't use anything like dynamic memory allocation. Don't use dynamically growing disks. Dynamically, that's the other one. Growing disks. You want to put in a fist? Yeah, I've often wanted to put a fist into Exchange. No, just kidding. You're going to want to put in a fixed disk size. And here's something to think about. Outside of the disk space requirements for your mailbox databases, because that's going to definitely add to this. Just give you an overall number for disk space that's going to be needed. Um, what you want to do is you want to make sure you have enough room for the paging file along with the disk space needed by Exchange. This is minus your database size. So what you want to do is you want to look at that. You want to allocate an additional, let's see here, 32, was it 32 gigabytes to your virtual memory. So to your virtual memory. So basically, if you had 8 gigabytes of RAM, add 32 gigs to that for your disk space, you're going to end up having 40 gig of disk space to start off with. 40 gig just to get started off with. And like I said, that doesn't include, if it's holding the databases, the database sizes. And also that doesn't include things like if you have single item retention cranked way up, that's going to increase your database size. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but you kind of get that idea. So, these are kind of the virtual machine requirements, kind of at minimum. One last thing. Please don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. I've seen guys do this. I've seen them do it with other things other than Exchange, and sometimes they've pulled it off, but don't do this. Have you ever used a differencing disk? Yeah, a differencing disk. This is kind of a nifty kind of concept. Differencing disks are where you have one hard drive, and I'm drawing it down here, that has like the OS and most of your components, and then you have little tiny disks that are differencing disks that are off of that give you your individual server personalities, if you want to think of it that way. So when this is running, it actually requires the main and the differencing disks to run. You can see that the I/O through all of that is going to be just a nightmare. So don't use differencing disks with Exchange. You might be able to do it on some other apps, but not Exchange. So again, at the end of the day, what it boils down to is this. You want a nice clean VM, and you don't want to play any games or tricks with it. So no snapshots. You don't want to do any memory over subscription, no dynamic disks, no differencing disks. You want a nice clean environment. You want to make it look and feel, and this is about the best way that I think of it. You want to make it look and feel as much like physical hardware that it's using, even though it's virtualized. Well, that's pretty good. What do you say we take a look at some performance aspects for Exchange? Okay, performance for Exchange. This topic is a topic that will continue on throughout this entire course. As a matter of fact, we've already seen some of it earlier in this course when we've looked at high availability and resilience and disaster recovery, using your DAGs, how to load balance things, getting the best out of them. Now, performance specifically and scaling for virtualization, which is just like your physical hardware, is a huge topic, and it changes depending upon who you are. Yeah, it sure does. Did you know that if you're a small company, it's going to be different hardware than if you're a large company? Of course you knew that. So it's kind of a challenge to figure this out. One of the things is I want to give you some recommendations here, and I want to start you on the path, and we'll be adding more and more to this as we go through it. Now, first of all, a couple of factors that are going to play into this. I'm going to give you some ballpark figures. Okay, so in this video, you're going to get some ballpark figures. I'll even show you how to get started with that really cool calculator. Some ballpark figures, I want you to understand where this comes from. Now, if you worked with Exchange previous versions, and let me go back to Exchange 2007, what it really comes down to is how do you determine what you need as far as hardware goes? Really, really, really starts to boil down to your mailbox role and the disks and the IOPS. Those are always the most important. It's not the only piece, but it's definitely one of the most important pieces. And how we would figure out how many IOPS you needed was how often are users hitting their mailbox? In other words, how many emails, and I'm going to try to draw a picture of an email coming in. How many emails come in per user per second, and how many do they send out? And that's and how many users overall do you have? This used to be referred to as basically a mail profile for your users. And this profile, there's a couple of ways to figure it out. One way to figure it out in prior versions of an Exchange is that there was an actual profile that would program that you could run that would go through some of your logs and statistics and figure it out for you. There's another way to do this, and a lot of us used to use perfmon. I don't know if you've looked at perfmon, but check that Greg Shields Exchange one. There are settings in perfmon for Exchange that show you messages per second and how many users, so you can get this profile information from your performance counters. And also, if you're using System Center Operations Manager, you can get this mail profile. And really, this mail profile then could be used to help us calculate out the IOPS that we needed. Now, there's this new thing that we have. It's the Exchange Calculator. But before I get to that, I just want to point out that you can pull these kind of statistics as well from Exchange by using PowerShell. Now, it's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world. I just want to point you to a resource. And now, because I've used this before, a guy by the name of Rob Campbell has a script that can help you pull this information using PowerShell. It's kind of a complicated script, okay? So it's not like a one-liner that you can dance through. But you can find this. Look for Rob Campbell. You can find it on the... have you guys, if you work with PowerShell, you ever been to the Scripting Guys blog? Yeah, the Scripting Guys blog out on TechNet. So you can just Google this. You can Google, hey, Scripting Guy, or Scripting Guys blog, and look for Rob Campbell, and you'll find an article that's on how to use PowerShell to track your email messages and email usage. And this is kind of cool. It makes a nice CSV. You can look at it in Excel, and it's pretty slick. Okay, so it's definitely pretty slick. That's one great way to do it. Your other options, again, are use perfmon, but you really need this profile, because when I show you this calculator in a second, I'm going to show you the section that it's asking you for this information. And we'll talk about that. You don't want to lie, because if you lie, then it just screws things up. So we don't want to lie to it. But anyways, before we get started, let me give you some ballpark. And these are the kind of typical Microsoft ballpark figures, but they work pretty well. So having talked about a mail profile, if you have a relatively light mail profile, which means that a user will send maybe 10 messages, and they might receive 40 messages in a day. And believe it or not, a lot of users actually meet that profile. So don't kind of look at that and go, well, I get about 300. Well, yeah, you're an admin, so you're going to probably get more. Just imagine help desk, right? But most of your users, that's kind of profile. So in this kind of profile, what you might be looking at is that one core, whether it's physical or if you're doing this as a virtual processor, can pretty much handle at that profile right around 1,000 active mailboxes. And Microsoft has dog-fooded their product for a long time, so these numbers are not too far off. I mean, I think you could use these as a great estimate to kind of figure out where you're at. So, if you have a couple thousand active mailboxes with a relatively light mail profile, you need a couple of cores for the mailbox profile. And we're talking about the mailbox role right now, so let me make sure that we're looking at the mailbox role, because we'll talk about CAS here in just a second. A couple of other ballpark figures is you want to have about 8 gig of memory to start with on a mailbox role. That's the minimum, right? 8 gig of memory is the minimum. And then for that relatively, I'm using a light profile here. You can add, around 3 megabytes of additional RAM for every mailbox that you're putting on there. So every additional mailbox, that's not a bad number to add to. So if you've got, in our case, let's say we had 1,000 active mailboxes. 3 times 1,000, well, there it gives me another 3 gig onto that. So it's what, 8, 9, 10, 11, 11 gigs. So, you're always going to want to round up, right? 12. I don't even think you put 11 gig into a box. So go to 12. But so you can see how the number of mailboxes will affect it. And this is still based relatively on this light to use profile. Now, something to keep in mind, remember, total size of your mailboxes. And we talked about this during the disaster recovery video, but remember the size of your mailboxes. Specifically, really, I want you to think about the overall size of your databases. And I gave you some numbers in there, but let me just throw a number out here. Let's say that the entire database size that had mailboxes on it was 200 gig. You know, the question I get all the time is, well, how big can I make a database, and how many mailboxes can I put on it? It really doesn't matter. I mean, are there limits? Sure, but it doesn't really matter. What it matters is how long does it take? See the DR? The DR means disaster recovery. How long does it take to recover that mailbox or that database should you need to recover it? And the answer needs to be, it should not exceed, and I'm not going to be able to spell exceed, but we'll get close. Not exceed your, did I get close on spelling the word exceed? Well, yeah, I'm sure somebody will tell me. Not exceed your SLA. So if your SLA says you've got to have a database recovered within 4 hours if you lose it, and your recovery mechanism, so in other words, your backup device, it takes it 8 hours to bring back your database, well, you blew the SLA. Don't make your database size any larger than what it takes to recover in your SLA, and that includes your mailboxes. And as we pointed out in the high availability, does this really matter? Yes, this really matters a lot, because some people haven't even thought about it. So they get these huge database sizes that take 2 or 3 days to recover. Well, that's not cool. That's not cool at all. Even though you have features like dial tone to help you get through those moments, you certainly don't want to wait that long. So don't let these exceed past your SLA. Now, a couple of other little performance things. That wasn't really a diversion. That was actually kind of part of all of this when it comes to sizing. A couple of other things, just remember, and I mentioned this before, things that will affect your database sizes is indexes on the database. Add about another 5% for indexes on your total database size. And your total database size will also be affected by whatever your single item retention is. So single item. Seriously, I can't spell single item. Wow, okay, single item. Whatever your single item recovery settings are. And so the default is what, 14 days that we let users recover stuff. I know a lot of admins like to take this out to 30 days. That is going to affect the size of their mailboxes. So you have to think about that and how that affects the size of your database, and then how it affects your recovery capabilities. So those are just some kind of notes that you want to have. Now, what kind of disks do you want to use for your mailbox role? And again, we're talking about the mailbox role here. I could have used a different color, I guess, for that. The mailbox role. Well, when it comes to the actual physical storage, you want it to be as fast as possible. Now, I'm going to show you that you can actually calculate out IOPS, all that kind of stuff. But, you know, let's just do right now we're just kind of doing the ballpark things. So you know that if you have disks that are 7,200 or better, you know, the 7,200 RPM, that's going to be pretty good. You also know that there's a big difference between, you know, your standard disks and an SSD drive. Kind of thing. One of the things to consider, and we talked about this in the high availability, so if you don't remember, go back to that one. We talked about JBOD, just a bunch of disks. When it comes to setting up storage for the mailbox roles, if I'm in a performance, if I'm in an environment where I'm pushing, you know, performance, one of the things I try to avoid is the SAN. And I'm not saying I always do. There's nothing wrong with a SAN. It's just that usually when you have one of these nice big SANs, usually there's more than Exchange on it, right? There's SQL on it. There's all kinds of databases out there. And you're sharing the IOPS with somebody else. I'm kind of a jealous person. I'm Exchange. I don't like to share. No, my sandbox. What just a bunch of disks does is it's great for your it's great for your performance, but remember, you're definitely going to want to consider your high availability. Those kind of go hand in hand. Now, tell you what, we've got this. Now, let me give you a couple of things for CAS. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to clear this guy again. Oh, I think I'm going to clear this guy. And I just have a couple of notes on CAS, and then I'll give you a demonstration in the calculator. And right now we're going to keep it simple, but let's see here. That didn't do what I thought it was going to do. I want to delete. Let's clear the screen. There we go. And so for your CAS box. Now remember, your CAS box, remember what that thing really does. It's a website. And a lot of guys go, well, it's a website. It doesn't really need much. Well, kind of keep things in mind. We have performance counters so you can watch this, but keep a few things in mind. It's more than a website. Remember, all your clients are connecting to it, all of them. Now, you can throttle different types of clients. You can control, what kind of clients can connect to your CAS box. What versions of Outlook. Does Outlook overweigh in performance things like iPhones, or I shouldn't say iPhones, I should say mobile phones, mobile devices. So you have a lot of throttling controls for your CAS box, but at the end of the day, your CAS box is doing more than just providing a website. It's actually kind of working. I like to think of it as a router. Yeah. And routers, they use some processing. They use some memory. They don't need much disk space usually, because I mean, remember the CAS box is never storing any email. But it is, something to keep in mind that, it is going to be heavy on usually memory and NIC because everybody's connecting to the CAS boxes. So when it comes to memory, just a general ballpark kind of figure for you is you want to use at minimum 4 gigabytes of RAM for that CAS box. And if you're monitoring performance and you need to increase it, you can. There are several performance counters available just for CAS, which Greg Shields had done in the earlier video, but just keep in mind that there are ways to look at how the website's performing, how many clients are connected to it, RPC or HTTP clients, versus just the HTTP or like IMAP and POP stuff. So also with that 4 gigabytes of RAM, you want to plan on a paging file on your disk that's going to be at least 10 gigabytes bigger than however much RAM you have, bigger than your RAM. Now again, this isn't, we're not talking a lot of disk space here, but if you're making fixed disk in your virtualized environment, you can see that with 4 gigabytes of RAM, I'm going to need a page file of 10 gig. I'm not storing any data. I think a lot of default sizes are like 20 gig for a fixed disk. Well, that seems pretty good here in this situation, doesn't it? I mean, a little bit over, but that's okay. A little bit over is not necessarily a bad thing. So the CAS boxes, remember about the CAS box load balancing, just like I had mentioned earlier on virtualization. Don't let the virtualization mentally mess you up. Notice I've got 2 hosts. I'm going to put a CAS box here and a CAS box here and load balance those. Don't put the load balance CAS boxes all on the same host. Just as a reminder, just wanted to throw that out. All right, tell you what, why don't we do a quick little calculator thing, because at least that'll be, that'll be a little bit fun, just so we can start to use it, because we're going to be using it quite a bit as we talk about other things. So let's do a little bit of a calculator kind of thing, and then we'll wrap this up. Now that wasn't too bad. We got some great ballpark requirements for performance. Oh, I kind of did that one. I should have done the requirement one first, but we've got some things to go off of to help us with some basic planning for how we want to set up our VMs on our virtualization platform. We got some of the requirements as well for Exchange, things that it doesn't like. Snapshots. Not a good thing that it doesn't like. Remember that one. Things like memory oversubscription, doesn't like that, doesn't perform well. You're kind of hurting the Exchange performance. And then, we talked about some of the things that it does like how many, processor cores you want to assign to it. So we got some great requirements, and we got some performance features set up for Exchange. We got some good ballpark things, but there's a couple of other ways to come up with some more accurate data if you would like, and that's what I want to show you in the third video. But let's go ahead and finish up this one, and then we'll get to the exciting stuff where I get to use a computer. So I hope this video has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.